Well, who says that you can't mix politics and Pilsners? So does it show that you were recording on your end?
I am. Yep.
Is this thing on?
We're live, baby.
Democrats destroy everything they touch.
We need to defend the police, not defund them.
MAGA, it's more than a man. It's a movement. In the 2020 election, free and fair, yes or no?
Absolutely not.
COVID has created a tyrannical government.
This is the only country in the world where those who hate it never leave.
Whether you like Pilsners, bourbons, or anything in between,
grab your favorite beverage and come have a drink with us.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Pilsners and Politics. Are you looking a way to support our podcast? Go ahead and go visit our Etsy store. Search Pilsners and Politics in the search bar. You can find a bunch of swag. We have shirts, sweatshirts. We just released our new Drain the Swamp. It's a 3/4 baseball tee, as well as our Defend the Dream coffee mug. Today we have Mike Peterman joining us, retired colonel from the U.S. Army. Mike, how are you?
Well, Benji, like to have this conversation. You and I have chatted the last couple of days, and with world events, it's going to be I think it's worth having and sharing our kind of how we see it, I guess. Right?
Yeah. Before we dive into the conflict or war in Ukraine, I guess we're going to try to define exactly what it is too throughout the show. I just want to talk about a new venture that we've joined up in. So we are now part of a larger group called the Patriot Podcast Network. And what this is, it's a one-stop shop for all your favorite podcasts on Roku TV or on a Roku device. All you got to do is go and search Patriot Podcast Network in the search bar. It's free to download. There's some really great podcasts on there. It's probably about 12 to 15 of us when we cover everything from politics to conspiracies to truth. Again, it's called Patriot Podcast Network. So, Mike, Ukraine is currently being invaded by Russia. I think a good place to start this conversation is, how do we define what's going on? Is this a conflict? Is this an all-out war? The mainstream media has used both terms rather loosely. In your opinion, what would you call it? What can we call it?
Well, I mean, they're using cluster bombs. I mean, they're using, at the high end of their weaponry against military targets, and they're having collateral damage against civilians. I don't think you could describe the effect of anything other than war. Now, in the spectrum of war, I mean, clearly with the threat of nuclear war that's coming out of this, but I think it's fair to say that there's conventional and both an insurgent kind of operations going on concurrently, with all the rest of the dime that we've talked about before, the capability of diplomatic, information, military, and economic. And there's a lot of players in this. But yeah, Benji, I would definitely fairly easily call this a kinetic type of combat, right?
What role do you think the United States should play in this? Do you think we should have boots on the ground and subject our people to that again? After we just withdrew from Afghanistan, or is this more of we just provide a mission support?
Well, so that's a tough question, right? I think if you look at what's going on currently in that part of the world, you really got to step back and have a historical perspective, right? I think one of the conversations we've generally kept coming back to is we as Americans sometimes don't really understand the history, and we don't really kind of apply it very well currently. Now, Russia and the Greek Orthodox Church are very connected to with that part of the world. When you talk about the outcome that is really working on in Ukraine, I mean, it's they've been connected for close to 1,000 years. Kiev and Moscow and that whole culture has way more history than our country has per se. I mean, Peter the Great and all that. When we were, just a thought of being a country, they were having conversation and relationships in that part of the world. Now the change really as the fall of the Soviet Union and we being the prominent and you could argue, the only superpower after the wall came down and Germany reunified and NATO was searching for a mission. All those kind of affected kind of what's going on today, right? And then you've had Putin in there. What has he been there 16, 15 years? KGB guy. He calls himself a Christian, a Greek Orthodox. So that's part of that. And I don't know if you read a lot of articles that are going on that kind of mention but Ukraine in 14 separated from the Church of Moscow, not unlike the Church of England separating from the Pope. So that's an underlying dynamic. That's all the resources in the Ukraine that has historically flowed towards Russia and towards the Russian Empire. Putin has just described the Brest-Litovsk Treaty after World War I, where the Germans forced them, basically the Bolsheviks, to strip away all of those provinces and make them independent countries. One of them being Ukraine. So there's a lot going on in this mosaic of a picture, and sometimes, and you can certainly see it on most of the news media where they kind of gloss over it. And then from the Ukrainian side, right, they've got a charismatic leader. They've got a people, the Ukrainians, that are very pro-Ukraine in most of the country, although there are big slides, the eastern part are very pro-Russian. And then there's also, there's been some thuggery going on in Yugoslavia with money laundering and a lot of other things that people have accused some of that going on, and the Nazification and some of those formations that are running around that without doubt have some Nazi kind of leaning, right wing kind of leaning. That's got to be troubling for us in the West. But so it's a hard answer now. But when Putin designed the campaign to come in and take down the government and put in somebody that's pro-Russian and try to move that inertia for Ukrainian to go to the EO or to NATO or to more reach to the West than reach to the East towards Moscow, I think we're in a place we haven't been in certainly our lifetime, but it's in a dangerous spot, right? You've got, Russia has nuclear weapons. They've got a nuclear deterrent force. They've modernized their military, and they've really made themselves in that region a economic, at least in the hydrocarbons, a contender to affect a lot of folks, both regionally and globally. I mean, so and it's interesting being a military officer. I spent a lot of time through all of the schools and through all practical and then also in combat operation is in thinking about and trying to understand campaign design and how do we as a military design the campaign and have the proper effect on what you're trying to get out of for both diplomatic, information, military. And clearly, it's the big M when the military is planning campaign ops. But it's a process of thinking, right? And I just what I've thought about the last 5 or 6 days, really, it's been a couple of weeks. Is I think he's okay. To start the process from the intel, right? I think he didn't have very good intel, he underestimated it or he dismissed some of the intel that he did have, and it's not the only folks that do that, right? You could argue that we missed that insurgency when Shinseki, Chief of Staff of the Army Shinseki, said that to Donald Rumsfeld before we went into Iraq, that we've got to have a lot more boots on the ground than we did, and it came back to bite us. Yeah, we liberated it, but then we had some hard slogging for a number of years, and because we did not get that campaign design right. And I guess the question, and this is a conversation for you, I'm interested to ask and think, what does he think his strategic outcome is going to be? Because the best of the Russian army right now is not looking very good. I mean, they're gonna grind it out, and there's no doubt that it'll be ugly, and there's no doubt that they can still win this. But cost wise, and it's just the visuals of. I saw a visual as being a Army logistician. I just thought it was interesting that a Ukrainian farmer was using his tractor to drag a Russian BMP off the battlefield. The crew had abandoned it, and that's a technique, but it's not a good one. So logistics, fires, integrated of combat operations, integrating, your air plan and all of those things that you've heard from all folks that are a lot smarter than we are talking about their cyber capabilities and their ability to affect, asymmetric warfare. It didn't show up, at least in the first 6 days. So, I've kind of rambled, but that's kind of where it's interesting. And those are the thoughts that have been kind of going through my mind. And from a diplomatic perspective, do you think that he was successful, or do you think he was not successful? Right?
No, I don't think he was successful. And, in my opinion, regardless of the outcome of this war, of this conflict, I don't think that he would win diplomatically, right? He's lost most of Europe. I think China has now started to take a back seat in regards to their support of Russia. So no, I think it's a lose-lose. And I want to go back and just talk about a couple of things that you had mentioned when you were talking. So I had said a few weeks ago, actually at the beginning of this war, that the United States has no place meddling in this business, and I'm here to correct myself on the record. In fact, in 1994, the U.S. and Russia had reached an agreement, and it was the Budapest Memorandum. For those who don't know anything about the Budapest Memorandum, and again, I didn't until I was schooled on it this week. Basically, it was Ukraine was to hand over their nuclear weapons, their nuclear deterrent, for assurances, right? Security assurances. So yes, I'm here to correct myself. The U.S. Does have some involvement in regards to the safety and security of Ukraine. But I'll also, on the other hand, also say that I don't believe that American boots should be on the ground, especially considering that we just came out of a 20-year, almost seemingly endless war in Afghanistan. I don't think our people are ready for another war, let alone the middle class. Mike, I want to ask you this. I want to pose this question to you before we move through Dime. Putting yourself in Putin's shoes, putting yourself in the Russian people's shoes, NATO is encroaching, and you mentioned this, NATO is encroaching on Moscow, right? They're moving further and further east. And I don't want to give Putin credit, but Putin had said something early on that how would the U.S. react if Russia was allies with Canada and Mexico, and all of a sudden he started building up troops on our border? How would we react, right? And I have a feeling that we would react in a similar manner, right?
Yeah, you're right. If you know the history, and a lot of folks may or may not know it. After the wall came down and Gorbachev and Bush the first, right, and his foreign secretary Baker made a oral agreement with Gorbachev that we would not expand NATO. And at the time, it was, I think in the dialogue I heard, was it'd be like spiking the football, because you'd won, right? You really wanted to bring Russia back into the world. We wanted to turn the economy back on. East and West Germany were coming together, and we pretty much kept that agreement. Now that started to change with Clinton. It changed again with George W. It changed again with Obama, and we have certainly not kept that. And some diplomats might argue, well, it wasn't written down in a treaty, but it's the conversation about having a schizophrenic foreign policy, because we go so far. Republican, blue team or red team, whoever's on there, have different takes on the same thing, and it makes some of our adversaries and some of our allies kind of look at us. So it's who you're dealing with, which United States foreign policy you're dealing with now. So yeah, I think there's some validity to that. He took Gorbachev and the leaders of then the Russian Federation took us at our word, and then as NATO started to try to kind of grip and try to get itself together to what is the next mission, And I think the conversation, I think if I remember right, that Putin had actually grabbed one of our presidents. I don't remember if it was Clinton or if it was George W. He said, why don't you let me join NATO? Because, if I'm no longer the threat, then why do you have NATO? And it's looking back, it's probably not a bad question for him to be asking. If we say that NATO wasn't really a deterrent to Russia, but we kept putting the money into it. Now we repurposed NATO during, Iraq and Afghanistan, and some of our allies fought in Iraq and Afghanistan pretty valiantly. Matter of fact, when I spent some time at U.S. European Command, I was part of the job we were doing. It was resource and training and getting some of our NATO brethren ready for combat. And getting them ready was really with U.S. kit. So it was interoperable and we could communicate, and you look like U.S. troops on the battlefield and all that. And the U.S. carried a lot of that financial burden to get them in the game. But yeah, a long way to say, yeah, I think there is, if you're Putin, I think there'd be some concerns. I think that, advancing into a country and taking it back on 7 axes, and in 14 taking Crimea, which was, historically one of the things that, the czars were trying to get for, the Black Sea access to, and to get something that looks like a warm port, to get their goods and services out and have a navy. And that put them into conflict with a lot of folks, to include, Istanbul and the Turks and the Ottoman Empire at the time. But so does that, although he's got a grievance and although he has that concern, does that give him a right to invade the way he did and use cluster munitions and some of the things you're seeing? Probably not. But can you, again, there's so much wrapped around the emotion of Ukraine in his mind. And if you read some of his statements and some of the stuff that a lot of our politicians missed, and they're going back and pointing to, really, he sees himself more like a Romanov than he does a Politburo. He's founded his organization in the Greek Orthodox Church. He's trying to professionalize his military. He's trying to bring his economy closer to the West. Some of the same things that Peter the Great, Catherine the Great tried to also to bring Russia out. And then, as that's not been successful, he's reaching out for other allies. And clearly the winner, when you talk about diplomatic, could be China. It could also be the EU, right? Because as we lose control of this diplomatically, does that strengthen EU's position? Yeah, sure. It could, unless this turns into a nuclear war and then everybody loses.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's in this whole very complex time, you hear the moronic conversation. The press secretary says the biggest threat to our nation is still global warming. Yeah, it's important, but holy shit, we got a guy that is just threatened to nuke the West. That's that's kind of a big deal, and maybe we stop sending Kerry around the world in his jet, worried about carbon tax and stuff until we get through this, right? I don't know. This is a complex problem, and it's not a 30-second bite on Fox News or CNN or CNBC, and it's you got all the graybeard generals that are certainly have their opinion. Petraeus and General Keane, both guys that I'd worked for in a prior life, very smart folks, trying to understand what Putin's doing. And unfortunately, hopefully, about 100 years ago, this kind of shenanigans got us into one of the greatest loss of life that we have seen in World War I. And it's not far out of, the Ukraine, as a stone flies, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Prince Ferdinand, right, and his wife, the Black Hand, started, a road to war, and all of these smaller countries in Europe jumped on and in the end, there was an inertia that took us to war when even the leaders of Germany and Russia and England all wanted to stop. The inertia carried us through to a massive bloodletting, which then kind of went into World War II. And so I think what broke my heart, frankly, is when you talk about the diplomatic stuff, we sent our vice president, the vice president of the United States of America, to the Munich conference. And then some of the feedback from our allies and our European delegates saying that it was less than helpful, some of the things that she was saying. And I'm probably on this one way more close to Team Red than I am Team Blue. But it just is, if you're an American and Putin sees the leadership in the executive branch as not decisive, not understanding, seeming weak, and then you've got the vice president going over and our allies are thinking some of the things is just buffoonery, that can't be helpful in a guy's mind like Putin. It can't be Xi or the president of India or, Iran. I don't know. I kind of went afield of what you were talking about, but it's a challenging, interesting time. And it reminds me in some regards of the history I've read about World War I. And, a couple of years ago, we had the 100-year anniversary of the end of World War I in 1918. This could go bad. It could go bad quickly if we don't hold on to an understanding. So going back to dime again, right? From a diplomatic perspective, the Russians tried to lay out their conditions and tried to get after it, but they had lost any diplomatic cred when they took Crimea and held on to it and really kind of, made everybody their cackles came up. From an information perspective or information ops perspective, Putin didn't do very well at all. I mean, you've got the president of Ukraine, an old comic or an old comedian that he's a rock star right now, right? He's none of his face pages are shut down. None of his access out for real-time video. And the message coming out of Russia from an information perspective isn't even convincing his troops or his own people, going into the event. That's and then from a military perspective, I think you're seeing the non-conventional forces of the Ukrainian people bowing up way more than the Russians thought. And in the Russians, their campaign design and their campaign executions, poor. I mean, the perfect campaign plan, right? Is you have strategic objectives and everything is integrated from army to corps to division to brigade to battalion to company. And, it's integrated, synchronized, coordinated. All the battlefield operating systems are all integrated to create the effect. And everybody understands from a decision support template, if the enemy does this, we're doing this, and all the way down to the company level. And then you're looking for initiative out of those orders that sergeants can execute, and because that's the point of the spear, right? That the United, at least for the U.S. military, it's the sergeant that carries the day and executes the hard mission of pushing the troops and carrying those tactical tasks that flow all the way down from the strategic to here. All that seemed to become desynchronized quickly, and if it continues to go that way for him, and there's no way for him to get out of it, it could get real bad for almost like Chechnya, right? In the 90s, that if you remember, I mean, they would shell whole parts of the city, and they didn't care who was there. And although we protested, there wasn't much to go. And then everybody's heard about the economic side. I think that he had tried to plan himself a way out with a bridge with the Chinese in advance of selling their fuel and their grain and holding on to dollars. But I don't think he expected in the economic side how the European Union, the Germans, and all that reacted. I mean, so that's before combat operations. So now let's forward that back. I mean, you have a conversation, but what does dime look like in your mind here in a week? Who holds the diplomatic advantage in a week? Is it?
I'd argue Ukraine holds the advantage, right? With the backing of the European Union. I can't help but to think that Putin knows, no matter which way this war goes, right? He's gonna lose, right? So even if he does capture Kiev and Ukraine falls to the Russians, he's gonna be isolated by the world, right? So my question is, you talk about the I and the M in regards to dime, right? Information and military. So naturally, I'm not a strategic planner, right? I was never an officer. I was just an enlisted member. But you would think that it's important to take out radio towers, right? Internet access, anything that can get information from the government of Ukraine to the troops and to the people. It doesn't appear that Putin did that. It doesn't appear that his people did that. So I guess the question I'm trying to pose is, do you think that he's using kids' gloves in this war because he knows he's going to lose regardless, and he's just trying to minimize the amount of casualties? Or Putin doesn't think that way, and he's just evil. He doesn't give a shit who he kills.
So I don't, you can throw the word evil around a lot, but I don't think he's designed, or his generals have designed, the low effect kind of, and like I say, kids' gloves. I do think there in his campaign, he was supposed to take all that internet down. He was supposed to take down the air defense. He was supposed to take down the power grid. I mean, some of the objectives, I'm sure, were go to those nuclear plants and take them off grid and turn those cities black. Not unlike we did with precision munitions in the first Gulf War, right? Or Serbia, or when we went into the air campaign under Clinton around Kosovo. So I don't think I just, one thing is, the Russians are not the boogeyman we thought they were, right? And not unlike
right.
When the wall fell and we got to really look at what the Soviet army really was behind the curtain. And, and again, all of the technology that during the first Gulf War that just got chewed up by the American technology. I don't think he went after it to lose. I just really think it goes back to he just didn't assess it correctly. And it's almost the hubris of the leader. Not unlike, I don't know if you heard that new Army IG report of why it went sideways for us in Afghanistan coming out. I mean, they told the president or the National Command Authority that we kind of need to come out on Trump's timeline because we don't have control. And basically they ignored the advice of the military and people in the Department of State and came out anyway. So the question is what's the dynamics in his own National Command Authority and within his own dynamic as his leaders, and who's clearly he's the one making the calls, but between him and the sergeant making the tactical tasks happen, they're just not showing up good. I mean, it's just, if this is the best of the privatized army, he's got to regroup and figure out where he's spending his money. Now, right. Don't underestimate the tactical situation. Don't underestimate, the Ukrainians are voting. But the question really is did he see the European unions, particularly Germany, which he thought pretty much they had over the barrel, because Merkel, being a good East German raised, Soviet, in that whole Soviet structure and a communist, all the way up until it was a free, a consolidated Germany. And she's on the board of that whole pipeline thing. If it not, so there's did he think that Germany was going to step back and say no? Did he think?
I think so.
Yeah, I think he missed that part. I think his diplomats did not understand it. I think, frankly, I think our president and a vice president in our State Department missed it as well. I don't think we had understood how much the EU wants to be it's the United States of Europe. I mean, they're looking for a place, right? And their backup militarily has been NATO, but the EU also wants to have its own forces, and some of them, that's one of the frictions that are out there, is they're double hatting European forces and NATO forces as the same, and it's a challenge. But did Putin expect to have the reaction that now the 30 NATO members are now going to up their military defense spending? Now, Germany kicked in $1 billion in real defense money. $1 billion, $1 billion, but frankly, they're way behind on some of their investments, and it's one of the things President Trump and President Obama and President George W. and all the way back to Clinton about them pitching in their share, right? Well, now they're agreed to buy in and invest in their military. We'll see if they keep their word. But I'm sure he didn't expect that.
No, I don't think he did either. And I think it's important to note, you had mentioned a few moments ago about how the Russian invading forces are a privatized military. Can you just speak to that a little bit? Because I think a lot of people, and even myself, I think when we think of world militaries, other world militaries, we just think it's just their citizens who are raising their hand and volunteering to go fight for their country. Is that an incorrect assessment? Is this his group of mercenaries?
No, they're not mercenary. But we went from after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the mass conscription of the Soviet army that both went into Afghanistan and also at the end of the Cold War were still remaining. They couldn't afford that army anymore, right? So they went with more of a European American model of volunteer force, right? So they bought into a volunteer force, and they still have reserves. They still have the whole similar structure they used to have, but they have a top tier readiness that they bought that are all mainly, their version similar to what we have, active duty guys, right? And my point was, we had heard that they were so much better, and some of the intel folks would say that this was going to be a cakewalk because the Russians. This is all open source, clearly. Somebody sitting behind a desk that's a Russian expert probably has a different perspective, but I mean, from open source, it was going to be a cakewalk. They were going to come, and then as soon as they crossed over, I mean, they don't have gas for their tanks, right? They don't have recovery vehicles. If you go back to that vignette of a Ukrainian farmer hooking up his tractor, dragging back the BMP to his own house because the crews kind of left it there.
Right.
And and it's the command and control. It's all that. It's aviation. It's targeting for fires. It's where's your MPs? Because there seems to be 4 or 5 accesses down the road. Who's doing route control, and where's your engineers, and what's if they drop a bridge, what's the plan to bring the logistics and bring the engineers, put the bridge back up to keep moving. I mean, all of those complex tasks that armies around the world struggle to do, they don't seem to be doing them very well. And again, we're only seeing what we can see, but it just doesn't look very good from an investment in a volunteer force and investing in the top tier of their readiness. The question we got to do is after this is all done and they lick their wounds, they've got to have an internal conversation about, frankly, did they spend the right money on the right stuff from a Russian military perspective? And you always want to kind of watch your opponent, screw things up. Don't get in the way of your enemy, shooting himself in the foot.
Right.
So, but that's one of the things that Putin's got to be asking his subordinates is, you told me on certain days that these are the objectives, and I'm sure they've got them. And it looks like they're all slipping. And it looks like they slipped right as they crossed the line of departure into Ukraine. I don't know if I answered your question. I kind of rambled a little bit.
Yeah, no, you absolutely did. And, to go back to the E in dime, you want to talk about economics. So, we placed sanctions on Russia, right? But I think a lot of people are asking if the United States was so serious about sanctioning Russia, why not open up domestic energy again here in the United States and sell it to Europe, so Europe isn't so dependent on Russia. I've heard a lot of pundits say that basically the oil sales, the gas sales that come out of Russia is basically Putin's private purse to do whatever he wants militarily. Do you think that a solution could be reopening up domestic energy exports and selling energy to Europe? I think it's a win-win.
So you're never going to get. I mean, I guess on this one, I'm absolutely pro-American, independent energy. I mean, you can disagree with President Trump on a lot of tasks, and you can honestly disagree with the president on a number of things. But independent energy, if you really are not of the global warming cult, and you can actually have a reasonable conversation with it, it only helps us as a nation to be able to affect not only our economy, because you heard it probably 50 times this week that when inflation happens and energy prices go up, it only really hurts the poor. It hurts all of us, but it doesn't really hurt the top 1%. It's hurting the men and women that are struggling to make ends of the bread loaf meet, right? And yes, we should be getting back after and integrating both with Mexico and with Canada and having really a North American campaign. I hate to say it, but a designed effect of how do we get more energy. And we ought to be having a conversation about nuclear. We ought to have a conversation about natural gas. We got to really have an effect on green, because green needs to be here. I'm not saying that doesn't need to be here, but it needs to be in places and we got to really invest in it. You can't throw money and have the Chinese come in and do it for us. It's got to be both sustainable from an energy perspective, but also sustainable from a national ability to maintain it, manufacture it, have the talent to keep it, and invest in the technology so yes, energy it underpins all our manufacturing, all our ability to keep the lights on, and it's a national security issue. It's if your energy prices go up 50% and you're a manufacturer, the cost of goods to your folks around the world are 50% higher. And petrochemicals go everything, the nitrogen that the farmers put in and it's all those medical devices that no one talk. I mean, it's just vast how much that touches of our daily lives. I mean, the cell phones we've got. I mean, it's just, I think the gloves have to come off economically. I think we've got to really understand how to invest in our own, and without a zealot, green or the deniers that there is, global issues on the environment, you got to have a middle ground that you can have a real conversation and get after the things we can agree on. But yes, I mean, I'm sorry. You can hear kind of where I'm coming from. I think I got some energy when it comes to our own personal energy as a nation to produce and take care of our own people.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that the price of energy has gone up more than 300% in the last year, and I think I had heard today within the last month or so, it's been 7% or so. But like you said, and kind of to piggyback on what you were getting at is, I just don't think that we can reason with this administration, especially when you have the energy czar John Kerry going to Egypt and saying, "Oh yeah, there's a war in Europe, but the northern tip of Russia is thawing out, so we should really focus on climate change." I think it goes to show you exactly where the priorities are of this administration. And as we record this, it's the night of the State of the Union, and I think that other than the fiction he's going to read us tonight, he's also going to dedicate a portion of time to climate change and how we as a world need to focus on it.
Yeah, 100%. And clearly, Team Blue has got their talking points, and the nation's gonna in November is going to vote for Team Red or Team Blue as we go into November. But in most states, the real effort is the primaries that are coming up here in March through July, August, right? So if you're regardless of which team you're voting for, that's the time that you really get to pick. But we're living in Huntsville, Alabama, so very strong Republican, not unlike where I'm from in Utah. I mean, Utah's pretty heavy conservative, and to make the change and get what you want, you really have got in both states where I've kind of ended up growing up and then deciding to live. You got to make your vote count in the primaries to really shape that, because it's so strong. And I'm sure it's the same way in upstate New York and where some real heavy Democrat locations. You got to vote, and you got to pick your reasonable person in both parties to try to find and go to the nation's capital and try to do the best for all of us. But I guess at the end of this thing is the losers in this are the Ukrainian people that are currently getting, killed and maimed and are living in the basement, right? And after it's all said and done, yeah, money will come in to fix the infrastructure, but it's still got to be fixed, and it doesn't happen in a hurry, and there's going to be some theft of the money coming in, and there's going to be some graft, and just you could name the country around the world after combat and all the money that comes in and where does it all go? Because, places like Haiti still, is Haiti before, and it's just the kids will be, playing in the rubble, and it's really sad, and it's sad. Now, do the Russians end up being losers? I mean, I can't see how they're not, but and then there's the silent partner, right? The Chinese, and I think the Chinese were taken back a little bit by the South Koreans and the Japanese stepping on the economic side and really, pulling the currency and not letting Russians move in their airspace and not shipping cars to Russia, and I think that's kind of getting the Chinese to kind of look and try to assess. And then, but what's in the Chinese mind is, okay, Chinese are supposed to have this very investment in their own readiness and their better military. It's one thing to cross the border in trucks. It's a whole different can of worms when you're going to do amphibious operations. And,
right.
We did hundreds of them in World War II, both the Army and the Marine Corps. And none of them were easy, and none of them are you really, talk about a combined arms operation. That's a challenge, and if the Taiwanese get their spine up like the Ukrainians, the Chinese have got to be reconsidering, and kind of looking at it. And I would wonder what the real readiness of the Chinese military really is, right? And
I think a lot of people had predicted that while Russia was invading Ukraine, the Chinese would do something similar in Taiwan, and I think the Chinese, again, like everybody else, just expected the Russians to run over Ukraine, and I don't think anybody anticipated the global community response, right? So I want to say, and again, I'm not very astute in Chinese politics or culture or even their country, but I think they see the response of the global community to Russia, and I think it's going to be equal, if not more, if they try to take Taiwan.
Well,
I think China. You want to talk about economics, right? I think China relies on the rest of the world to buy their garbage, and that's what props up a majority of their economy. And I think the moment that everybody just stops buying their trash, they would crumble.
Well, yeah, I think there's that, but I think the Chinese also have a longer game, right? Culturally, they're playing the long game, and that's one of the things that, and we've talked about this before from just the Chinese party and the Silk Road initiatives and how they're working things around the world and gaining influence and putting people basically in debt to them is very strategic. It's very methodical, but I do think that, as like you said, watching the performance of the Russian army in what should have been a reasonably easy task to take down a number of cities. And Taiwan is again, it's you have to come across the sea, you have to get there, and there'll be folks there that will inhibit the Chinese. The Australian Navy, the Japanese Navy, and you could say a lot of things about our Army, and we probably do have the best Army in the world, but there's no doubt about it. We have the best Navy in the world. I mean, and we really are a sea power, and we really are a Pacific power. And a lot of folks forget that because we really kind of focused on Europe. But I mean, our coastline on the West Coast, to include Africa or to Alaska, is it's all in the Pacific, right? So we definitely have a dog in that fight when it talks about, because we're a Pacific nation, although China would say we're not. We definitely are. But I guess going back to on topic is, what do you think now that Putin has seen these unintended consequences of a clumsy military operation, poor diplomatic execution, very poor informational access, and then the effects of the economic against him? Where does he go?
I think he continues to barrel into Ukraine. I don't foresee him surrendering or withdrawing to save face, I guess, for lack of a better word, right? He holds himself to high esteem. He's a very, in his mind, a very stoic person, right? The leader of, he wants to bring back the glory of the old Russia. I think the only solution to this, it will probably be some sort of ceasefire agreement between Russia and Europe, where he can sell it back to his people as a victory, right? But I just don't see him conceding.
So where do you think, from the European Union perspective, do you think they're winners or losers out of this?
I think the EU is winners, especially considering that today the EU voted to accept the application of Ukraine. And again, it goes back to, you had mentioned that the United States is kind of taking a back seat to this entire conflict, and the EU is stepping up and I guess showing true leadership, right? If that's what you want to call it.
Yeah, or are we leading from behind like the Obama administration had? I mean, is that the plan for the Bidens? But I agree with you. I think the European Union is now being able to show its muscle. They really haven't had much to do, and I think it's in their own best interest, because it's the house is on fire right next to their their subdivision, and they've got to take some. So where do you think, from a military perspective, where do you think NATO ends up? Is that a win for them, or is that a?
Oof. I do. I think if anything, Putin showed NATO that there's an absolute necessity for them to be involved in the country of Ukraine. What's your take?
Well, I mean, so here's the question that bothers me a little bit about the expansion into Estonia and the republics that were, without a doubt, they were part of Russia, right? So we've given them, Article 5 guarantees that if Russia, well, then we are in war, right? And how is that really different than the role that everybody could see happening prior to World War I and today? I mean, we clearly have the same risk of not only another war on the continent of Europe with a whole bunch of smaller countries that are beating their chest and really talked about mobilization of their armies, which turned out to be not very good, but got a lot of the bigger allies pulled in that, and there was a bloodletting on the continent, which turned out to be a world war, right? And then, if you could argue that what predicated out of that peace agreement was World War II. And so we don't want to be there. And you see some of the shenanigans on the internet of folks that were, anti-trucker, whatever, are all in the same voice saying, hey, we need to do a strike at nuclear weapons. I mean, clearly, you've lost your darn mind if you think that a first strike nuclear is kind of what we should be thinking about and talking about in the discourse. I think you've lost your darn mind, or you're so. I mean, you banged your head to the point that you've got brain damage. I mean, because it's just because once it starts, it's on and it's not good, and it's everything, and it's every horrible thing that we trained and fought and thought about in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, and I kind of want to go back if we're talking about another world war or even the potential of a nuclear war, which again I don't foresee it going that far, because I think no matter how passionate you are about, and again I might regret saying this, but no matter how passionate you are about whatever reason you're invading a country, I think we can all come to terms with the fact that a nuclear war will probably be one of the last wars fought. And I think the leaders of all these countries, at least these nuclear powers, know that. What message do we send the rest of the world when we send Kamala Harris to Europe and she can't string together a sentence? And we've alluded to this multiple times on the show so far about how she kind of bumbled her way through it, and our allies in France and the rest of Europe are making fun of us. I want to play this clip for the listeners who haven't heard it, so then they can make up their own mind, and then we could briefly talk about it before we wrap up.
We still sincerely hope that there is a diplomatic path out of this moment. And within the context then of the fact that window is still although it is absolutely narrowing, but within the context of a diplomatic path still being open, the deterrence effect, we believe, has merit. I mean, listen, guys, we're talking about the potential for war in Europe. I mean, let's really take a moment to understand the significance of what we're talking about. It's been over 70 years. And through those 70 years, as I mentioned yesterday, there has been peace and security.
What sense does that make? It doesn't make any sense. The window of opportunity is opening, but it's closing. And
well, that's that whole, we got war comment is what I think I heard on the French, English translation, and then also, because you got to jump around to figure out what the news clip, but the Europeans hammered her hard on that, on the sophomoric comment. I mean, they're like using the subdivision analogy. I mean, they're watching the subdivision next to them on fire. Do they not think that and know that the thing is? And I just, gosh, I don't know. And it breaks my heart. I mean, she is not a dumb person. She, from all measures, she is But her delivery, her political acumen, her understanding of relationships and how to influence people is she's got a ton of blind spots, and everything that she seems to have latched onto, from the crisis on the southern border to mitigating this, has not turned out well. I mean, if it wasn't so serious of a thermonuclear war, and I know I'm being a little dramatic, but I mean, when the guy that's not quite right, at least from his actions right now, that's where he wants to take it. And she's saying comments like that, and it's not really helpful. And because of those facts, maybe that is why the EU is stepping in and managing the crisis instead of letting the other superpower lead this conversation. Maybe it's we've given up our moral position because of buffoonery and comments like that. We were not treated as a nation very well as a rep from the Europeans, and I think there was an Irish broadcaster that also just. I mean, Benji, I don't know, man. We're on the cutting edge of mediocrity with that crew right there. I mean, I got it. Trump was a knucklehead when his delivery. He had pretty solid policies. And yes, he couldn't his ego couldn't get out of the way of keeping him from saying, Bronx humor that clearly he got and most of the folks got, but there's a whole bunch of folks that don't get that humor, and it got him into trouble, and then it got him into trouble with folks that were not his friend in the media, and his message got lost.
I think it's safe to say that he, on the international stage, he displayed what America is, right? We are a strong nation. I want to take you back on a timeline real quick. So Obama was in office, and Russia took Crimea, and they also took Georgia. Was Georgia under Bush, or was that under Obama?
I can't recall. I don't think it was under Bush. Or it was under Bush, and he was so immersed in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the war in Afghanistan was kind of pulling our whole focus. But I can't recall. But certainly Crimea, and that's one of the things. If you hear a discussion why Secretary Clinton was, she was the Secretary of State when all that melted down, and she took that personally, that he would do that to her, as the Secretary of State. So those two apparently don't have a lot of love. I don't know. It's all speculation, but clearly there's scars on the Clinton side from that, from the books and from other things that other folks have said. Clearly, I don't know the Secretary.
Right, and then under Obama, we had sailors captured by the Iranians. Nothing happens on the international stage that I can really think of under Trump. And then here we are in the Biden administration, and Russia is invading Ukraine. So I like him, love him, hate him. I think Trump at least let our adversaries know that while it's under his watch, it's not time to play with the United States. I want to close up with your take. How do you see this ending in Ukraine?
Well, like I said, I think it very easily could go badly if it's not managed and having some adults in the room to make sure that we don't have the slippery slope of the World War I analogy that we keep talking about. The only thing that I think that will do that is if you remember the history or anything prior to World War I, there was a lot of enthusiasm for let's get in the big fight for, most of the citizenry around Europe, right? You don't see that right now for from the protests in Hungary and in Germany and even in Russia, or so. And hopefully the people of Europe will pull their governments back from being ass clownery. I kind of agree with your assessment. I think that he's going to get to a midpoint of certain objectives, right? And he's going to declare victory. Regardless if he gets his campaign objectives that started on, day zero, before they cross the line of departure, he's going to get to a point that he's either culminated or it's a political point that somebody gives him an out. And he's going to declare victory, and he backs up, and then he comes out and he gives everything back except those regions that are pretty much 90% Russian anyway, that have been the contention since 14, right? So he'll get a little piece, and he'll get to walk away, and the European Union's declare victory, and then the losers are really the Ukrainians, because the ways the news media works, 2 weeks after it's all over and peace is declared, the cleanup of a cities, streets, schools, hospitals, roads in Ukraine is going to take years. And where does that money go that we ship in? Does it get go into Swiss banks and disappear and don't really show up on construction program? That's certainly a possibility with some of their track records in that country. I think NATO has got a infusion of enthusiasm, at least from money, and I think they're going to start moving in the right direction. And it's not just President Trump, because all of the presidents before have done it. He was just the most vocal and kicked him in the shins publicly. So and if they would have done that, there was really a strong German military or a strong, a deterrent, then there may not be something. But, the reason there's peace in Europe that Kamala Harris talked about is because the American army was standing on the border. And then, the peace dividend after the wall came down, they weren't going to share it, and rightly so. We didn't need to have that combat power, because going back to the discussion, we didn't need to spike the football and leave our people there. There was no need for it, because we were trying to be safe. So what's the discussion on NATO? Does U.S. move forces back? Do we? And there's no doubt that in NATO's perspective, the money's going to go up. We're at some of the lowest. Personally, U.S. is some of the lowest GDP on defense than we've ever had, and in a long, long while, right? So infusion of cash, and it's very expensive to have armor brigades in Germany. It's very expensive to have corps. I mean, it's massively expensive. But if that's the calculus, then that's the unintended consequences that probably Putin didn't want. And frankly, American guys and gals that have signed up for the military are over there really are a deterrent to shenanigans on both sides, right? Because we got a lot of faults as Americans, but we generally, if we make the decision to be your friend, we're your friend. If we make the decision to come kick your ass, we're going to come kick your ass. So we're going to do the best thing we can, and then after that, we're going to pick you up and dust you off. And which is no other country in the world you could kind of say that. And examples are. We talked about all of Germany and Japan and some of the most economically robust countries in the world were in a different conflict. We had kind of mauled. But I hope in the next 3 or 4 days we come to the Russians culminate, and then we start the real diplomatic. And then I hope quickly we come back and we turn the Russian money back onto the Russians, and because it's the Russian people that hurt. But I think we got to hold the hard line, and then we got to watch China. I think China is the risk. I think China is the silent partner that everybody kind of watches past, and we say it, but what are we really doing to counter that? And I mean, I kind of ramble, but there's a lot to this. This should not be a celebratory moment. I mean, this could be very scary. I mean, it could be, and we want to have peace, and you got to think about the Ukrainians and the Russian soldiers that are losing their lives, and war is fought by young men when old men are back cheering for them, and it's young men and some women that are paying the ultimate price for both sides, and it's tough, right? And it's tough to see friends that you train, but a nation's got to do it, and the nation has to commit to it when it's time to do it. But I really don't think the U.S. should be putting dudes in there. I don't think that we should be helping out, but I think we really have come back to the Obama administration that we're leading from behind. And that'll be interesting to watch, right? Because if the EU starts to take the lead, we have less than as much influence in that organization from a political perspective, because I think there's some tensions between us and the EU. But that's where I think, Benji, you just got to be thinking about because it's tough times right now in that part of the world, and there's a lot of folks that are concerned about it.
I think Ronald Reagan summed it up the best when he said, "We achieve peace through strength." So, Mike Peterman, thank you so much for your contribution. As always, it's great to have you on the show. I love getting your perspective.